A German Shepherd won't stop crying after his owner's death. No one can calm him. No one can explain his pain until the vet checks his collar and freezes. Inside, a hidden message reveals something shocking, something no one was prepared for. What was left behind? And why does this dog refuse to move on? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The gray clouds hung low over Fort Benning, matching the heavy hearts of those gathered for Lieutenant Liam Carter's funeral. The steady drum of rain against umbrellas provided a somber rhythm as soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms dark with moisture. 6-year-old Ethan Carter sat in the front row, his small hands wrapped tightly around the folded American flag. His face showed no tears, no trembling lip, just an empty stare that seemed too old for his young features. Beside him, Rex, the German Shepherd, who had been both his father's military partner and their family protector, sat perfectly still. Only his drooped ears and occasional whimper betrayed his confusion. The chaplain's words drifted through the air, but Ethan didn't seem to hear them. His focus remained fixed on the flag in his lap, his fingers tracing the precise triangular folds over and over. 3 days later, a social worker led Ethan into the Matthews foster home. Mrs. Matthews tried her best, offering him cookies and showing him to a room with bright blue walls and superhero posters. But Ethan simply clutched his father's old watch and climbed onto the bed, turning his face to the wall. "Dinner's in an hour, sweetie," Mrs. Matthews said softly. But Ethan didn't respond. He hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. Meanwhile, across town, Rex paced the empty halls of the Carter home. Each night, as darkness fell, his howls echoed through the neighborhood. He scratched at the front door until his paws were raw, waiting for the familiar sound of Liam's truck in the driveway. "That dog's been going at it for days now," Mr. Peterson complained to his wife, picking up the phone to call animal control. "Someone needs to do something." The next morning, 2 officers approached the house carefully. Rex didn't resist. He seemed too tired, too heartbroken to fight. They loaded him into their van, his tail tucked between his legs. At the shelter, Dr. Catalin Ryler ran her hands gently over Rex's coat, checking for injuries. "He's obviously well trained," she murmured, noting his excellent condition despite the raw paws. "Military dog, by the look of him." When she reached for his collar, Rex lifted his head slightly, allowing her to examine the tags. Among them was a worn military ID with an address and name, Daniel Graves. Dr. Chen's fingers lingered on the tag. She glanced at Rex's sad eyes, then at the phone on her desk. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the receiver. Daniel Graves jolted awake, his t-shirt clinging to his sweat-soaked body. The small cabin's darkness pressed in around him as his heart hammered against his ribs. In his mind, the echoes of gunfire and screams still rang clear, the same nightmare that had haunted him for the past 3 years. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the lamp switch. Light spilled across the cluttered room, empty bottles, crumpled papers, and dirty clothes scattered everywhere. The cabin had become his refuge, or maybe his prison, since returning from overseas. Running a trembling hand through his disheveled hair, Daniel reached for his cigarettes. The flame from his lighter briefly illuminated a framed photograph on his nightstand. 2 soldiers in desert camo, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Liam's smile was the same one he'd worn even during the ambush, right before. Daniel grabbed the photo, his cigarette dangling from his lips. "Should have been me, brother," he whispered, tracing his finger along the edge of the frame. "Should have seen it coming." The sharp ring of his phone cut through the morning silence, making him jump. He almost ignored it. He usually did. But something made him reach for it this time. "Mr. Graves?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Dr. Chen from Riverside Animal Shelter. We have a German Shepherd here, military trained. We found your address on his tag." Daniel's throat tightened. "Rex?" "Yes, that's right. He belonged to Lieutenant Liam Carter. Given your connection and the military tag, we wondered if you'd be willing to take him in." "No." The word came out harsh, automatic. "I can't. I'm not that person anymore. I can't help you." He hung up before she could respond, his hands trembling worse than before. That night, rain pounded against the cabin's tin roof. Thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning illuminated the woods outside. Daniel sat in his worn armchair, trying to drown out his thoughts with whiskey when he heard it, scratching at his front door. At first, he thought it was just tree branches in the wind. But the sound continued, deliberate and persistent. Daniel set down his glass and approached the door slowly. When he pulled it open, his breath caught in his throat. There stood Rex, his fur matted and dripping, mud coating his paws. The German Shepherd's intelligent eyes fixed on Daniel's face, patient and expectant. Somehow, he'd escaped the shelter and tracked Daniel down through miles of wilderness. Rex didn't bark or whine. He just stood there in the rain, waiting, as if he'd known all along where he needed to be. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, rain drumming against the cabin's metal awning. Rex's fur dripped steadily onto the wooden porch, creating small puddles at his feet. The German Shepherd's eyes never left Daniel's face, patient and unwavering in the dim porch light. "Damn it," Daniel muttered, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. He stepped aside, leaving just enough space in the doorway. Rex padded in slowly, his wet nails clicking against the hardwood floor. The dog's nose twitched as he took in the cabin's musty air, moving deliberately through the cramped space. When Rex found Liam's old army jacket thrown carelessly over a kitchen chair, he stopped. His nose pressed against the familiar fabric, and a small whine escaped his throat. Carefully, he circled the chair 3 times before settling down beside it, his chin resting on his paws. The next morning, Daniel paced the cabin's small living room, phone pressed to his ear. "What do you mean he keeps escaping?" he demanded. Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the speaker. "This is the 3rd time, Mr. Graves. He chews through any restraint, finds ways around our security. He won't eat, won't respond to any of our staff. He just grieves." Daniel glanced at Rex, who hadn't moved from his spot by Liam's jacket. "That's not my problem," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Graves, please." "I'll bring him back tomorrow." Daniel hung up, deliberately avoiding Rex's gaze. Throughout the day, Daniel kept his distance, busying himself with mundane tasks. He cleaned his guns, organized his toolbox, anything to avoid acknowledging the dog's presence. Rex remained still, watching Daniel's every move with those knowing eyes. That night, the nightmare came again. Daniel was back in the desert, bullets whizzing past his head. Liam was calling out to him, but he couldn't reach him in time. The explosion rocked the ground, and Daniel shot up in bed, gasping for air. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a shape beside his bed. Rex sat there, alert and vigilant, just like the K-9 units that used to watch over them during long nights in the field. The dog's presence was steady, grounding. Daniel's racing heart began to slow. For the first time since returning home, the crushing weight of solitude lifted slightly. He reached out a trembling hand, and Rex leaned his head into it, offering silent support. The next evening, Daniel sat on the porch steps, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Rex lay nearby, his eyes fixed on Daniel's face. The silence between them felt different now, less hostile. "Fine," Daniel whispered finally, his voice rough. "You can stay, but just for now." Rex's tail thumped against the wooden boards, a gentle acknowledgement, but his gaze drifted past Daniel, toward the empty gravel road that led to the cabin. He stared into the distance, as if waiting for someone else to appear through the gathering dusk. The old truck rumbled down Main Street, its engine protesting every gear shift. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his head thrust out the window, ears flapping in the wind. His tongue lolled out, tasting the morning air as they made their way into town. Daniel pulled into the shelter's parking lot, gravel crunching under the tires. Dr. Chen was already waiting outside, a manila envelope clutched in her hands. Her face was drawn, serious. "Mr. Graves," she said as Daniel approached, "there's something you need to know." She held out the envelope. "These are some legal documents about Liam Carter. He had no surviving family members." Daniel's throat tightened. "What about his boy?" "Ethan's in foster care." Dr. Chen's voice softened. "He's at the Hamilton House, just off Pine Street." 20 minutes later, Daniel parked across from a weathered Victorian house with peeling blue paint. Rex pressed his nose against the window, watching intently. In the backyard, a small figure sat alone on a rusty swing set. Ethan's feet barely scraped the ground as he swung listlessly, his head bowed, shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself invisible. His father's watch hung loose around his tiny wrist. 2 adults stood on the back porch, drinking coffee and chatting, barely glancing at the boy. Rex's whine filled the truck cab. His paws scratched at the window, leaving marks on the glass. His whole body trembled with recognition. "Easy, boy," Daniel muttered, but his own hands were tight on the steering wheel. He watched as Ethan kicked at the dirt, creating small clouds around his feet. The foster parents laughed at something, their voices carrying across the yard. But Ethan didn't look up. According to Dr. Chen, he hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. Daniel's jaw clenched. He knew what it was like to feel alone, to think no one cared. But taking care of a kid? He could barely take care of himself some days. That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the letter from the vet's envelope spread before him. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on Daniel's boot. The paper trembled in Daniel's hands as he read Liam's familiar scrawl. "If anything happens to me, don't let Ethan be alone. Don't let him grow up thinking no one wanted him. Please, Danny, you're the only family we have left." Daniel set down the letter, his hands shaking. Rex lifted his head, placing it gently on Daniel's lap. The dog's eyes seemed to hold all the weight of Liam's last request. Daniel's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel outside the Hamilton house. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered Victorian's facade, making it look even more imposing. In the back seat, Rex whined softly, his tail thumping against the leather. Liam's words echoed in Daniel's mind. Don't let him grow up thinking no one wanted him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath that filled his lungs with the crisp morning air, and pushed open the truck door. The porch steps creaked under his boots as he approached the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last. He knocked 3 times, the sound sharp against the peeling blue paint. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down. "Mrs. Callahan?" Daniel asked, clearing his throat. "I'm Daniel Graves. I was Liam Carter's friend." Her expression didn't soften. "If you're here to see Ethan, I should warn you. He doesn't talk to anyone. Hasn't said a word since he arrived. We've had other visitors, and he just sits there." "I'd still like to try," Daniel said firmly. Mrs. Callahan sighed and stepped aside, letting him enter. The house smelled of old carpet and cheap air freshener. She led him to a small living room where Ethan sat in an oversized armchair, his small frame almost swallowed by the faded fabric. The boy's eyes were fixed on nothing in particular, his father's watch still hanging loose around his wrist. "Hey, Ethan," Daniel said softly, kneeling down to the boy's eye level. "I don't know if you remember me, but I was your dad's friend." Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. It was like talking to a statue. "Your dad and I served together. He used to talk about you all the time." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Still no response. Then came the sound of nails clicking on hardwood floors. Before Daniel could stop him, Rex bounded past, heading straight for Ethan. The dog's tail wagged furiously as he pressed his nose against the boy's hand. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, the first sign of life Daniel had seen. Rex whined softly, laying his head in Ethan's lap. The boy's lower lip trembled. Then, like a dam breaking, tears began rolling down his cheeks. His small arms wrapped around Rex's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs as Rex nuzzled closer, offering the comfort only a loyal dog could provide. Mrs. Callahan watched from the doorway, her eyebrows raised in surprise. But her voice was cold when she spoke. "Ethan is set to be permanently placed with another family soon. If you're here just to stir up emotions, don't bother." Daniel kept his eyes on Ethan and Rex, his jaw set firmly. He'd already made his decision. The next day, Daniel sat in his parked truck, the letter trembling in his calloused hands. The paper was worn now, creased from being folded and unfolded so many times. Liam's messy handwriting blurred before his eyes. "You're the only family we have left." He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, his breath coming in short bursts. The responsibility felt overwhelming. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the explosion that took Liam, heard the screams that still haunted his nights. How could someone who couldn't even sleep through the night take care of a child? The downtown law office loomed before him, all glass and steel. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniel shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair across from Mr. Peterson, a gray-haired lawyer with wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Graves," the lawyer said, shuffling through the papers, "I need to be honest with you. This won't be easy. Your military discharge due to PTSD is going to raise red flags with the adoption board." Daniel's throat tightened. "I'm getting help for that." "And your employment situation?" "I do odd jobs, construction mostly." Mr. Peterson leaned back, removing his glasses. "No steady income, no experience with children, and a documented history of trauma-related issues." He sighed. "The courts look for stability, Mr. Graves. They want to ensure the child's well-being." Daniel stared at his hands, rough from work, scarred from war. The lawyer was right. He barely had his own life together. The cabin was too small, his nightmares too frequent, his future too uncertain. Later that afternoon at the Hamilton house, Daniel watched from the doorway as Rex lay beside Ethan's chair. The dog hadn't moved since they arrived, his eyes fixed on the boy as if memorizing every breath. Ethan's small fingers were tangled in Rex's fur, holding on like the dog might disappear if he let go. Then so quietly Daniel almost missed it, Ethan's lips moved. "Rex," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Rex." Daniel's heart stopped. It was the first time he'd heard the boy's voice, soft and broken, like a bird testing its wings after a fall. Rex's tail thumped against the floor, and he nuzzled closer to Ethan. Taking a deep breath, Daniel crossed the room and knelt beside Ethan's chair. The boy didn't look up, his eyes still fixed on Rex. Daniel's hands shook as he gathered his courage. "I'm gonna take care of you," he said softly. Slowly, like the sun breaking through clouds, Ethan lifted his head. For the first time since they'd met, his eyes met Daniel's, deep brown eyes, just like Liam's, filled with a mixture of pain and hope that made Daniel's chest ache. The autumn air was crisp as Daniel, Ethan, and Rex walked down the quiet sidewalk. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet, creating a gentle rhythm that matched their slow pace. Ethan kept his small hand pressed firmly against Rex's back, his fingers buried in the shepherd's thick fur. The dog walked carefully, matching his stride to the boy's shorter steps. Daniel glanced down at Ethan, noting how the child's eyes darted around, taking in everything but saying nothing. The silence between them felt heavy, like a thick blanket, but Daniel didn't push. He remembered how it felt after losing someone, how words seemed too big, too hard to form. They passed old storefronts and park benches until they reached Joe's Diner, its neon sign flickering in the late afternoon light. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. How many times had he and Liam sat in those worn booths, planning their futures over cups of coffee that never seemed to empty? Inside, the smell of grilled onions and coffee filled the air. They slid into a red vinyl booth, Rex settling protectively at Ethan's feet. A tired-looking waitress brought them menus, her expression softening when she saw Ethan. After ordering burgers and fries, Daniel cleared his throat. "You know, your dad and I used to come here all the time." He watched Ethan's fingers trace patterns on the worn tabletop. "Want to hear a story about him?" Ethan didn't respond, but his shoulders tensed slightly, showing he was listening. "We were overseas, in a pretty scary situation," Daniel began, keeping his voice gentle. "Our whole squad was pinned down. Everyone was stressed, and the radio wasn't working." He smiled at the memory. "Your dad, he starts telling these terrible jokes, just the worst ones you can imagine. Like, why don't eggs tell jokes? They'd crack up." A tiny twitch appeared at the corner of Ethan's mouth. He kept going, until finally, everyone was laughing so hard we could barely hold our weapons. That laughter, it cleared our heads. We found a way out, because we could think straight again. Your dad saved us all that day, just by making us smile. Ethan's eyes flickered with recognition, and his grip on Rex's fur tightened. Though he didn't speak, his body relaxed slightly, leaning into the story like a flower turning toward the sun. As they finished their meal, Daniel heard Mrs. Callahan's voice from near the diner's entrance. She was speaking into her phone, her tone hushed but clear enough to carry. "Yes, tomorrow at 2 works perfectly," she was saying. "The Hartleys are very excited to meet him. I think we can finalize everything within the week." Daniel's stomach clenched as he watched Ethan methodically arrange his French fries. The boy seemed unaware of the conversation that was deciding his future, but Rex's ears had perked up, his brown eyes fixed intently on Mrs. Callahan. The next day, Daniel's phone buzzed while he was fixing breakfast. Rex's ears perked up as Daniel answered the call from his lawyer, Sarah Martinez. "Daniel, we need to move fast." Sarah's voice was urgent. "The Hartleys are scheduled to take Ethan by the end of the week. If you want any chance at guardianship, we have to file the paperwork today." Daniel's hand froze mid-stir, the eggs burning in the pan. "Today? But I haven't even—" "There's no time," Sarah cut in. "The system moves quickly once they find a permanent placement. Either we file now, or Ethan goes to the Hartleys." The smell of scorched eggs filled the kitchen. Daniel switched off the stove, his mind racing. "What are my chances?" "I'll be honest, it won't be easy. Your PTSD, the cabin's condition, your employment situation." Sarah paused. "But you were named in Liam's letter, and you have a military background. That counts for something." Daniel looked at Rex, who sat watching him intently. "Send me the papers. I'll sign whatever you need." After the call, Daniel drove Ethan back to the foster home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. The boy sat quietly in the passenger seat, one hand resting on Rex's head, where the dog leaned forward from the back. The truck rolled to a stop in front of the plain two-story house. Neither of them moved at first, the engine idling softly. Ethan's hand tightened in Rex's fur, his small shoulders tense. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Time to go in, kid." Ethan didn't budge. He turned in his seat, looking at Daniel with wide eyes that seemed to ask 1,000 questions. His lower lip trembled slightly, and Daniel could see the fear there. The same fear he'd noticed at the funeral, when Ethan had clutched that folded flag like it was his last connection to the world. "I'll see you soon, kid," Daniel said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Ethan's eyes dropped to his lap. He turned and gave Rex one final fierce hug, burying his face in the dog's neck. Then, without a word, he slipped out of the truck and walked toward the house, his backpack looking too big for his small frame. As Daniel put the truck in gear, Rex let out a high-pitched whine. The dog pressed his nose against the window, pawing at the glass as he watched Ethan disappear inside. The sound cut straight through Daniel's chest, reminding him of those nights in the desert when they'd lost someone. That same confused, mournful tone. Daniel's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to drive away, to return to his solitary life where he couldn't fail anyone else. But Liam's voice echoed in his mind. Don't let him grow up thinking no one wanted him. His jaw clenched as he made his decision. He wasn't going to let Ethan face this alone. Not this time. Daniel sat in the stiff leather chair, his leg bouncing nervously, as Sarah Martinez's colleague, Mr. Caldwell, spread documents across his polished desk. The morning light filtering through the office windows felt harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every wrinkle in Daniel's worn jacket. "I need to be direct with you, Mr. Graves," Caldwell said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "You don't have a steady job, you have no history of caregiving, and your PTSD is a concern. The adoption board won't make this easy." Daniel leaned forward, his voice tight. "I was Liam's best friend. We served together. I know things about Ethan's father that no one else does. Stories, memories. That has to count for something." "It does," Caldwell admitted, shuffling through the papers. "But the Hartleys, the family set to adopt Ethan, they have everything you don't. A 4-bedroom house in a good school district. Both parents have stable careers. They've raised 3 children, 2 of whom are now in college." He paused, looking at Daniel over his glasses. "They can provide the stability Ethan needs." "With all due respect," Daniel's voice grew stronger, "they can't give him what he really needs, a connection to his father. They can't tell him about the time Liam saved our whole unit with a joke in the middle of a firefight. They can't show him the watch his father wore every day during his service." His hands clenched into fists on his knees. They can't help him understand where he came from. Caldwell sighed, pulling out a stack of forms. "The process will be difficult. Are you sure you want to proceed?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Yes." The next hour passed in a blur of signatures and legal terminology. When Daniel finally left the office, his hand was cramped from signing papers, but the guardianship request was officially filed. The drive home felt longer than usual. When Daniel pushed open his cabin door, Rex was lying beside the couch, his nose pressed against a small blue blanket Ethan had left behind during their last visit. The dog's eyes were fixed on the fabric, a soft whine escaping his throat. Daniel knelt beside Rex, running a hand through the shepherd's thick fur. "We'll get him back," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sat in his truck outside the Department of Child Services, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel in an anxious rhythm. The same battle-honed instincts that had kept him alive in combat were screaming at him now. Something wasn't right about this situation. His stomach churned with the familiar tension he'd felt before missions gone wrong. Ms. Phillips, a tired-looking social worker in her 40s with dark circles under her eyes, met him in her cramped office. Papers were stacked everywhere in precarious towers, sticky notes dotted the walls, and a half-empty coffee cup sat on her desk beside a family photo that had collected a thin layer of dust. "The Hartleys have an excellent record," she said, though her eyes didn't quite meet his, focusing instead on a spot just over his shoulder. "They've fostered several children over the years, currently living in Oakwood Heights, both successful professionals." She shuffled through some papers, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet office. "I really shouldn't be sharing this much, Mr. Graves." "Please." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "I just need to know Ethan will be safe." Ms. Phillips hesitated, then spoke softer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've had a few complaints, but nothing ever stuck. Always explained away." When Daniel visited Mrs. Callahan's house later that day, he noticed how she tensed when he mentioned the Hartleys, her shoulders going rigid. Her fingers twisted her necklace nervously, the gold chain cutting into her skin. "They're a wonderful family," she said quickly, too quickly, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Very generous. They always send Christmas cards." "How many kids have they fostered?" Daniel asked, watching her face carefully. Mrs. Callahan's smile tightened like a rubber band about to snap. "Oh, I wouldn't know the exact number. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have dinner to prepare." She practically pushed him toward the door. That night, Daniel's dreams were worse than usual, filled with shadows and echoes. He was back in the ambush, bullets flying, Liam's voice calling out through the chaos. But this time, when he turned, he saw Ethan being pulled away into darkness by faceless figures. The boy's face was terrified, his small hands reaching out desperately. Daniel tried to run after him, but his feet wouldn't move, like they were trapped in quicksand. He woke up gasping, his shirt soaked with sweat, Rex whining beside his bed. The dog's concerned brown eyes watched as Daniel got up and paced the floor, his bare feet silent on the wooden boards. Something wasn't adding up. The Hartleys looked perfect on paper, too perfect, like a magazine spread. Mrs. Callahan's nervous behavior, Ms. Phillips' hesitation, the mysteriously dismissed complaints. His military training had taught him to trust his gut, and right now every instinct was on high alert. Daniel grabbed his keys, the metal cold against his palm. He needed to see the Hartleys' neighborhood for himself, to put eyes on their operation. As he drove toward Oakwood Heights in the gathering dusk, he didn't know he was about to stumble onto something much darker than he imagined, something that would change everything. Daniel parked his truck a block away from the Hartleys' house, his trained eyes scanning the pristine two-story colonial. Everything looked picture perfect. Manicured lawn, gleaming windows, fresh paint. But something felt wrong. There weren't any bikes scattered on the driveway, no basketball hoop, no chalk drawings on the sidewalk. For a couple supposedly passionate about fostering children, their home looked more like a museum than a family house. He watched as Mr. Hartley left for work in an expensive car, his wife waving from the doorway in designer clothes. They looked like they'd stepped out of a real estate magazine, all surface, no substance. Walking the neighborhood with Rex, Daniel spotted an elderly woman tending to her garden next door. He approached casually, keeping his voice friendly. "Beautiful day," he said, patting Rex's head. "I'm actually looking into the neighborhood for my cousin's son, Ethan. I heard the Hartleys might be adopting him." The woman's hand stilled on her flowers. She glanced nervously at the Hartleys' house before speaking in a low voice. "They've had quite a few children come through. Sweet kids, all of them." She paused, twisting her gardening gloves. "But they never stay long." Always some reason why it doesn't work out. Last boy, Tommy, was here just 3 months before they sent him back. Daniel's chest tightened. He thanked her and headed straight to the public library. At a computer terminal, he dug through adoption records and newspaper archives. What he found made his blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, the Hartleys had fostered 8 different children. None had stayed longer than 6 months. Each case ended with the children being returned to the system, usually after complaints about behavioral issues. The pattern was clear. Take in a child, collect the government checks, then find an excuse to send them back. Rinse and repeat. With printed copies of the records in hand, Daniel drove to the Department of Child Services, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Ms. Phillips looked up from her desk as he burst in, spreading the documents before her. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the dates. 8 kids in 5 years. All returned. That can't be coincidence. Ms. Phillips picked up the papers, her face growing more troubled with each page. "I knew something felt off, but—" She set the files down, rubbing her temples. "I'll look into it," she promised, but her voice wavered slightly. Daniel leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Ethan's placement hearing is in 3 days. Once they get him—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of that quiet, hurting boy being used as just another paycheck made him sick to his stomach. Ms. Phillips nodded slowly. "I'll look into it," she repeated, more firmly this time. But as Daniel left her office, the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, each second bringing Ethan closer to becoming the Hartleys' next victim. The evening sun cast long shadows across Daniel's cabin when his phone rang. Ms. Phillips' voice came through, tense and urgent. "Daniel, I've been looking into what you showed me about the Hartleys. There's more going on here than we thought. Mrs. Callahan, she has connections with them. Previous foster kids have filed complaints, but they keep disappearing from the system." Daniel sat up straighter, his free hand curling into a fist. "What kind of complaints?" "I can't discuss details over the phone," Ms. Phillips said. "But if you care about Ethan, you need to see this for yourself. Tonight." Within minutes, Daniel and Rex were in the truck, driving through the darkening streets toward Mrs. Callahan's house. He parked around the corner, out of sight. Rex's ears perked up as they approached on foot, staying in the shadows. Through the lit window, Daniel could see Ethan's small form in his bedroom. The boy sat on his bed, shoulders slumped forward, staring at his father's old watch. The sight made Daniel's chest ache. He looked so small, so alone. Just as Daniel was about to turn away, movement caught his eye. Mrs. Callahan appeared in the doorway. Her face twisted with irritation as she said something to Ethan. When the boy didn't respond, she strode forward and grabbed his arm roughly, yanking him to his feet. Ethan flinched hard, his face contorting in pain. The watch slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. Beside Daniel, Rex let out a low, threatening growl. The sound rumbled deep in the dog's chest, his hackles rising. Daniel felt his own anger surge, hot and dangerous. His military training screamed at him to move, to act, to protect. But he forced himself to stay still, documenting everything with his phone. Mrs. Callahan released Ethan's arm, leaving visible red marks on his skin. She pointed at him, saying something Daniel couldn't hear through the glass, then stormed out of the room. Ethan rubbed his arm, his face blank again, that same emptiness Daniel had seen at the funeral. It was the look of a child who had learned that showing pain only made things worse. Daniel's hands shook as he dialed Ms. Phillips' number. She answered on the first ring. "I just saw Mrs. Callahan grab Ethan," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "She hurt him. Tell me what I have to do to get him out of there." Ms. Phillips' office felt smaller at night, the shadows from her desk lamp creating dark corners that matched the gravity of their conversation. She shuffled through papers, her face tight with concern, as Daniel sat across from her, his shoulders tense. "Look," she said, folding her hands on the desk. "I believe you about Mrs. Callahan. But if you want to prove Ethan is in danger, you need more than a hunch. You need real evidence." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "What kind of evidence?" "Documentation, witnesses, anything concrete that shows a pattern of abuse or neglect." She lowered her voice. "The system won't act without solid proof." The next few nights found Daniel parked down the street from the Callahan house, Rex a steady presence in the passenger seat. His military training came in handy, staying alert during long hours of watching and waiting. But this wasn't like his missions overseas. This time, a child's safety hung in the balance. On the third night, with the summer air warm and still, an open window carried sounds from the house. Ethan's muffled crying drifted out into the darkness. Rex immediately stiffened, his ears forward, a low whine building in his throat. Mrs. Callahan's voice cut through the night, sharp and angry. "Stop that crying right now, or I'll give you something to cry about." Through the window, Daniel could see Ethan's small shadow, backing away from the larger one approaching him. When the boy's silhouette flinched, Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The metal creaked under his grip. He couldn't just sit here anymore, but he also couldn't risk doing something that would get him arrested and destroy any chance of helping Ethan. With trembling fingers, Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He stopped at a name he hadn't called in years: Jack Mercer. Jack had been a detective before leaving the force to work as a private investigator. More importantly, he understood what it meant to follow your gut when something wasn't right. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Mercer." "Jack, it's Daniel Graves." A pause. "Danny, been a while. What's wrong?" Daniel explained the situation about Ethan, Mrs. Callahan, and the Hartleys, about the missing complaints and the pattern he'd noticed. His voice grew tight as he described hearing Ethan cry. Jack listened without interrupting. Finally, he said, "You want me to dig into their backgrounds?" "Yes, there has to be something we can use to stop this." "I'll look," Jack agreed, but his tone was cautious. "But Danny, you should know, this could get messy. People like the Hartleys, they usually have friends in high places." The phone rang at 3 a.m, jolting Daniel awake. Rex lifted his head from the foot of the bed, ears perked. Daniel grabbed his phone, recognizing Jack's number. "I found something," Jack said without preamble. His voice was tight with anger. "The Hartleys aren't just bad foster parents. They're running a scam." Daniel sat up straight, fully alert now. "What kind of scam?" "They take in kids, collect the government checks, then file complaints saying the children are unmanageable. The kids get sent back into the system, but the Hartleys keep collecting money until the paperwork catches up. By then, they've already moved on to their next target." Daniel's stomach turned. "And Ethan?" "Just another paycheck to them. They've done this to at least 6 other kids in the past 3 years. The complaints are always the same: behavioral issues, inability to adapt, aggression, all lies." Daniel paced his small living room, running a hand through his hair. "If they get Ethan, he'll be lost in the system for years," Jack finished. "And here's the kicker. The Callahans are in on it. Mrs. Callahan's been fostering long enough to know exactly what happens to these kids. She feeds them to the Hartleys anyway." Daniel grabbed his keys. Within minutes, he was driving to Ms. Phillips' office, the morning sun barely peeking over the horizon. She was already there, working early as usual. When he laid out everything Jack had found, Ms. Phillips sank into her chair. Her face went pale as she flipped through the documentation. This, she swallowed hard. This explains so much. The pattern of complaints, the quick turnarounds. She looked up at Daniel, her hands shaking slightly. I can push for a temporary stop on the adoption. But without Ethan speaking up about what's happening at the Callahans, it won't be enough to keep him safe long term. Daniel walked back to his truck, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He caught his reflection in the side mirror, the tired eyes, the worry lines etched deep. For years after leaving the military, he'd run from fights he didn't think he could win. He'd hidden away in his cabin, letting the world pass by. But not this time. This wasn't just about honoring Liam's memory anymore. This was about saving a little boy who deserved better than being treated like a meal ticket. He gripped the truck door, jaw set with determination. He was done playing by rules that protected the wrong people. If breaking every regulation in the book was what it took to save Ethan, then that's exactly what he would do. The night air was thick with tension as Daniel parked his truck a few houses down from the Callahans. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, while Rex paced restlessly in the passenger seat. The German shepherd's ears were perked, his body taut with anticipation, as if he could sense something was about to happen. His low whine echoed Daniel's own anxiety, a sound that made the hair on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. The street was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Most houses had gone dark, their windows black against the moonless night. A single streetlight flickered weakly at the corner, casting strange shadows across the pavement. But in the Callahan home, a single light still burned, Ethan's window on the second floor. Daniel leaned forward, squinting through the darkness. A small figure appeared at the window, and his heart clenched when he saw Ethan press his palm against the glass. The boy's eyes were wide, scanning the dark street below with unmistakable fear. Even from this distance, Daniel could see the tension in the child's shoulders, could read the desperation in every line of his small body. Mrs. Callahan's shadow passed behind Ethan, her silhouette looming large and threatening. And then the boy did something that made Daniel's breath catch. He started pushing the window open. With quick, desperate movements, Ethan began climbing out onto the narrow ledge, his small fingers gripping the window frame so tightly they turned white. No, Daniel muttered, already reaching for his door handle, his soldier's instinct screaming at him to move faster. But before he could move, Ethan's foot slipped on the wet shingles. The boy tumbled through the air, his pajamas fluttering in the night breeze, landing hard on the grass below with a muffled thud that seemed to echo in Daniel's chest. Rex burst into action before Daniel could stop him. The dog leaped through the truck's open window and sprinted across the lawn, his paws silent on the damp grass. He reached Ethan in seconds, and the boy immediately wrapped his arms around Rex's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. His whole body was shaking, small tremors running through him like autumn leaves in a storm. Daniel ran to them, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. When he reached Ethan's side, the boy looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, his face pale in the dim light. "Please don't make me go with them," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse and broken, clutching Rex's fur like a lifeline. Daniel reached down and gripped the boy's hand, pulling him gently to his feet. The child's fingers were ice cold against his palm. "You're coming with me." The truck's engine roared as Daniel pressed the accelerator, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Ethan sat pressed against Rex, his small fingers tangled in the dog's fur. The boy's face was ghostly pale in the passing streetlights, his hands trembling as they clung to his only source of comfort. Daniel's mind raced faster than the truck. He'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Taking Ethan from the Callahans, even to protect him, was kidnapping in the eyes of the law. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, as he pulled out his phone, dialing Ms. Phillips with shaking fingers. "I have Ethan," he said without preamble. "He tried to run away. I couldn't leave him there." Ms. Phillips' voice crackled through the speaker, tense with worry. "The Callahans will report this. If you don't handle this right, you could lose Ethan forever." "I'm not taking him back." Daniel's voice was firm, even as his stomach churned with anxiety. He ended the call and immediately dialed Jack. "I need help," Daniel said when Jack answered. "I've got Ethan with me." Jack's response was quick and clear. "Get to a motel. Lay low for the night. I'll make some calls." 20 minutes later, they were in a small motel room with faded wallpaper and a flickering lamp. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, Rex's head in his lap. The boy hadn't said a word since they left. But now he looked up at Daniel with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "You knew my dad." His voice was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse. Daniel sat down in the worn armchair across from him, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, kid, I did." Ethan's fingers twisted in Rex's fur as he gathered courage for his next question. When it came, it hit Daniel like a physical blow. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" Daniel's throat tightened. The truth was heavy on his tongue. He'd been afraid of failing, afraid of not being enough, afraid of letting Liam down one more time. But looking at Ethan now, this brave, broken little boy who'd already lost so much, Daniel knew one thing for certain: he wasn't running anymore. The neon motel sign cast an eerie red glow through the thin curtains, painting shadows across the worn carpet. Daniel sat in the creaky armchair, watching Ethan wrap himself tighter in the scratchy motel blanket. The boy's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but he fought against sleep, jerking his head up every time it started to droop. Rex lay between them on the floor, his head resting on his paws, but ears constantly moving, tracking every sound from the parking lot outside. A car door slammed somewhere, and the dog's head lifted slightly, nose twitching as he assessed the potential threat. The small TV mounted on the wall flickered to life as Daniel turned it on, keeping the volume low. His heart sank as the news report filled the screen. Ethan's school photo smiled back at them, the words "Amber Alert" scrolling beneath it in bold red letters. "Damn it," Daniel muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He'd known this was coming, but seeing Ethan's face on the screen, hearing the reporter describe him as a missing child, made everything feel more real, more dangerous. Ethan stared at his own image on the screen, his small fingers twisting in the blanket. "They won't believe me, will they?" His voice was barely audible, thick with fear and resignation. Daniel turned to face him, shaking his head slowly. "Not yet, but we're going to make them listen." His phone buzzed, Jack's number lighting up the screen. Daniel answered immediately, moving toward the bathroom for privacy, but keeping Ethan in his line of sight. "I've got something," Jack's voice was urgent. "The Hartleys. They've been doing this for years. I found bank records, suspicious transfers to social workers. They're buying people off to keep their operation going. I've got proof, but we need someone willing to look at it." Daniel's jaw clenched as he processed the information. After a moment's thought, he knew there was only one person who might help them: Ms. Phillips. She'd shown concern before, had tried to investigate within the system's constraints. Maybe now, with real evidence, she'd be willing to do more. Walking back into the main room, Daniel knelt in front of Ethan. The boy looked small and fragile in the dim light, but there was a strength in his eyes that reminded Daniel of Liam. "We're going to fix this, kid," Daniel said softly, "but I need you to trust me." Ethan studied Daniel's face for a long moment. Rex moved closer, pressing against the boy's leg in silent support. Finally, Ethan gave a small nod. "I trust you." The morning sun had barely risen when Daniel pulled into the empty parking lot of the Child Services building, Ethan dozing in the back seat with Rex. The boy startled awake as the engine cut off, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Ms. Phillips was waiting at her office door, her face a mix of emotions. As soon as she saw them, she ushered them inside, checking the hallway before closing the door firmly behind them. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she hissed, her voice low but intense. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled the blinds closed. Daniel stood straight, keeping himself between Ms. Phillips and Ethan. "I know exactly what I did. I protected him when nobody else would." He laid out everything. How Mrs. Callahan grabbed Ethan too roughly. The boy's desperate attempt to escape. The pattern of abuse that had been ignored. His voice grew harder as he described the Hartley scheme, how they cycled through children for profit. A knock at the door made them all jump. It was Jack, carrying a thick manila envelope. He nodded to Ms. Phillips as he spread documents across her desk. Bank statements, suspicious transfers, complaints that had been buried. "Look at these dates," Jack pointed out. "Every time they take in a new kid, money moves to these accounts. Some belong to social workers who've since left the department." Ms. Phillips studied the papers, her professional facade cracking as she saw the evidence of corruption in her own system. She looked at Ethan, who sat quietly in the corner with Rex pressed against his legs. "Ethan," she said gently, "do you want to go back to foster care? We can find you a different home. They hurt me." Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a certainty that filled the room. His small hands gripped Rex's fur as he continued, "I don't want to go back." Miss Phillips exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead. The weight of this situation, and her responsibility, showed clearly on her face. She believed them. Daniel could see it in her eyes. She reached for her phone, her jaw set with determination. "This is going to get messy," she said, dialing the number for the Child Services Director. Looking up at Daniel, she added, "But I'll fight for him." Daniel nodded, his hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. They'd crossed a line bringing Ethan here, but sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Ms. Phillips' office as she made call after call, her voice growing more insistent with each conversation. Daniel paced near the window, while Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, his fingers buried in Rex's fur. "Yes, sir," Ms. Phillips said into the phone. "This is an emergency situation. We need that hearing today." She drummed her fingers on her desk, listening. "No, it can't wait until—" The distant wail of police sirens cut through the morning quiet. Daniel's military training kicked in, his muscles tensed, his senses sharpened. Ethan's head snapped up, fear flashing across his face. The sirens grew louder, then stopped. Car doors slammed outside. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. 2 uniformed officers entered the office, their faces stern. "Daniel Graves?" the taller one asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Mrs. Callahan has filed kidnapping charges," the second officer said. "You'll need to come with us." Ethan scrambled to his feet, wrapping his arms around Rex's neck. The German shepherd's fur bristled, but he stayed perfectly still, anchoring the trembling boy. Daniel raised his hands slowly, keeping his voice steady. "I didn't kidnap him. I saved him. He was trying to run away when I found him." "Mr. Graves is right." Ms. Phillips stood up, moving between Daniel and the officers. "We have evidence of abuse in the foster home. This boy needs protection." "Ma'am, we have our orders." The first officer reached for his handcuffs. The door burst open. Jack strode in, waving a document. "Actually, you don't want to do that." He thrust the paper at the officers. "Emergency stay order. Nobody moves this kid anywhere until there's a proper hearing. Unless you boys want to explain to a judge why you helped cover up child abuse." The officers studied the document, exchanging glances. The taller one spoke into his radio, confirming the order's authenticity. "And I've already called Judge Martinez," Ms. Phillips added, her voice sharp. "She's very interested in why certain complaints about the Hartleys kept disappearing." The officer shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the second one nodded. "We'll note that Mr. Graves is cooperating with Child Services." He turned to Daniel. "But don't leave town." They filed out, their footsteps fading down the hallway. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief as he buried his face in Rex's fur. The air in the office remained thick with tension. Everyone knew this was just the beginning. Daniel might avoid arrest for now, but he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Few days later, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Daniel sat beside Ms. Phillips, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white from the tension. Ethan perched on the chair between them, his feet barely touching the floor, the new shoes Daniel had bought him scuffing against the polished wood. Across the aisle, the Hartleys wore matching expressions of practiced concern, their designer clothes and perfect posture screaming affluence, while Mrs. Callahan kept her eyes fixed on her hands, fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Henderson, studied the papers before her with pursed lips, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her weathered face. The Child Services Director stepped forward, a thick folder in his hands, papers threatening to spill out. "Your Honor, this is a complex case. While Mr. Graves' actions were unorthodox, we have substantial evidence of negligence in Mrs. Callahan's home." His voice echoed in the hushed courtroom. Ms. Phillips presented her findings methodically. Photographs of bruises on Ethan's arms, documentation of the Hartleys' suspicious pattern with other foster children, financial records showing irregular payments. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady and professional. "Furthermore," she added, straightening her glasses, "Mr. Graves has maintained steady contact with his VA counselor. His PTSD is being properly managed, and he's shown remarkable progress." The Hartleys' lawyer stood, adjusting his silk tie with manicured fingers. "Your Honor, Mr. Graves is a troubled veteran who kidnapped a child in the middle of the night. His military discharge clearly states he's unstable. He lives alone in a cabin, has no steady employment, no experience with children. How can someone who can barely take care of himself raise a 6-year-old boy?" His words dripped with calculated disdain. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, years of military discipline evident in his rigid posture. Ethan watched the adults argue, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair until his knuckles matched Daniel's. Suddenly, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I want to stay with Daniel," Ethan said, his voice shaking but clear in the quiet courtroom. Everyone turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. He swallowed hard but continued, his chin lifting slightly. "My dad wanted me to be with him, and Rex wants me to be with him. He's my family." His words carried the simple truth of a child's heart. The silence that followed felt heavy, thick with tension and unspoken emotions. Judge Henderson studied Ethan carefully, noting his determined stance and the way he unconsciously leaned toward Daniel, then shifted her gaze to Daniel. After what seemed like an eternity, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years of similar decisions. "This case requires careful consideration. Until I make my final decision, Ethan will remain in Mr. Graves' temporary custody." She tapped her gavel once, the sound sharp and definitive. Court adjourned. Daniel released a shaky breath, squeezing Ethan's shoulder gently, feeling the boy's warmth through his Sunday best shirt. The boy leaned against him, relief visible on his small face, as the tension slowly drained from his tiny frame. Daniel pulled into the driveway of his cabin, the gravel crunching under the truck's tires. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the worn wooden porch. Rex jumped out first, circling the yard with renewed energy, while Ethan lingered in the passenger seat, his small hands clutching his backpack. "Come on, kid," Daniel said softly, opening Ethan's door. "Let's head inside." The cabin's interior felt different now, warmer somehow despite its sparse furnishings. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, his backpack dangling from his fingers, eyes taking in the space as if seeing it for the first time. The old couch, the scratched coffee table, the photos of Daniel and Liam on the wall. It all meant something different now. "So, we're staying?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, hope and uncertainty mixing in his words. Daniel knelt down to his level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yeah, buddy, we're staying." But even as he spoke the words, a knot formed in his stomach. He'd been in enough battles to know when something felt off. That night, after tucking Ethan into the spare room with Rex curled protectively at the foot of his bed, Daniel tried to sleep. The house creaked and settled around him, familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. But around midnight, Rex's sharp bark cut through the darkness. Daniel's eyes snapped open, military instincts kicking in. Rex barking grew more intense, aggressive, a warning. Moving silently, Daniel retrieved his service pistol from the lockbox in his closet, the weight familiar in his hands. At the window, he pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. Mrs. Callahan stood in his driveway, her figure illuminated by the motion sensor light. She was talking to someone, a man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch. Their hushed conversation carried an air of urgency that made Daniel's skin crawl. The morning brought no relief. Daniel's phone rang just as he was making breakfast, Ms. Phillips's name flashing on the screen. Her voice was tight with concern. "Daniel, the Hartleys pulled strings with someone higher up. They're trying to overturn Judge Henderson's ruling about temporary custody." She paused, papers rustling in the background. "They're coming for Ethan. Today." Daniel watched through the kitchen window as Ethan played with Rex in the backyard, the boy's laugh floating through the glass, a sound that had been so rare just days ago. His hands clenched into fists, jaw tightening. "They're not taking him," he said, his voice low and determined. "I'm done playing by their rules. If the system won't protect him, I will." The next day, Daniel sat stiffly in the leather chair of Mr. Caldwell's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished desk. Beside him, Ethan perched on the edge of his seat, one hand buried in Rex's fur for comfort. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses, his expression grave. "This is it, Mr. Graves. Our final hearing is this afternoon. If we can't convince the judge you're fit to adopt Ethan, the Hartleys will gain permanent custody." He leaned forward, his voice softening. "There won't be any more appeals after this." The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. Daniel glanced at Ethan, whose small fingers tightened in Rex's fur. In the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Ms. Phillips stood before Judge Henderson, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, we have uncovered evidence of systematic fraud by the Hartleys." She gestured to Jack, who approached with a thick folder. "They've been exploiting the foster system for years, taking in children solely for financial gain, before discarding them back into the system." Jack stepped forward, presenting document after document. "We have proof of multiple instances where the Hartleys bribed social workers to overlook complaints. Mrs. Callahan was their primary source for vulnerable children, deliberately placing kids she knew wouldn't fight back." The Hartleys' lawyer jumped to his feet, his face flushed. These are baseless accusations, Your Honor. My clients are upstanding members of the community. Are they? Ms. Phillips interrupted, producing more papers. Because we have signed statements from 3 former foster children detailing their experiences in the Hartley's home. We also have bank records showing suspicious payments to Mrs. Callahan after each placement. The Hartley's lawyer stammered, trying to redirect blame, but his arguments grew increasingly desperate. In his chair, Ethan pressed closer to Rex, his eyes fixed on the judge's face. Judge Henderson studied the evidence, her expression darkening with each page. The courtroom fell silent as she looked up, her gaze settling first on the Hartleys, then moving to Daniel and Ethan. After reviewing all evidence presented, she began, her voice stern, and considering the testimony provided, I have reached my decision. She paused, fixing the Hartleys with a hard stare, before turning to Daniel. Mr. Graves, you will be granted full custody of Ethan Carter. The words barely had time to register before Ethan launched himself from his chair into Daniel's arms. Hot tears soaked into Daniel's shirt as Ethan clung to him, his small body shaking with sobs. Daniel held him tight, his own eyes burning as relief washed over him in waves. Rex pressed against their legs, tail wagging, as father and son embraced, finally, officially, permanently, a family. Few days later, Daniel stood in the doorway of the small bedroom, watching as Ethan carefully folded his last t-shirt. The foster home felt different now, emptier, quieter. Rex sat patiently by their feet, his tail sweeping across the worn carpet. Ready, buddy? Daniel asked softly. Ethan nodded, but his hand lingered on the windowsill. He traced the little marks he'd made there, counting days like prisoners did. His small shoulders tensed as he took one last look around the room that had been both his shelter and his prison. We can take a minute if you need it, Daniel offered, understanding how even bad places could become familiar. Ethan shook his head, grabbed his backpack, and walked out without looking back. Rex followed close behind, protective as always. The drive home was different this time. As they passed familiar streets, Ethan's voice broke through the quiet. Did you know Dad used to watch SpongeBob with me? He asked suddenly. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror, surprised by the words. Yeah? He did all the voices, Ethan continued, a small smile playing at his lips. He was really good at Patrick. His words came faster now, like a dam breaking. And sometimes, when I got good grades, he'd take me to get ice cream. We'd always get chocolate with sprinkles. Daniel listened, his heart aching with each new detail. All these memories, all these little pieces of Liam and Ethan's life together, had been locked away for so long. At school, I'm really good at math, Ethan added. Dad said I got that from Mom. Did you know her? I met her once, Daniel replied gently. She was really smart, just like you. As they pulled into the driveway of their home now, Rex burst out of the car the moment the door opened. He circled Ethan excitedly, barking and wagging his tail, as if celebrating that this time was different. This time was forever. Later that night, Daniel tucked Ethan into bed, smoothing the covers just like Liam used to do. Rex settled into his usual spot at the foot of the bed, ever watchful. Ethan looked up at Daniel, his eyes serious in the soft glow of the nightlight. Can I call you Uncle Danny? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel felt his throat tighten, remembering how Liam used to call him that. He nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. Yeah, kid. You can. The autumn breeze rustled through the cemetery's oak trees, scattering golden leaves across the quiet grounds. Daniel parked the truck near the iron gates, his hands steady on the wheel for once. Beside him, Ethan clutched a wooden picture frame to his chest, while Rex sat alert in the back seat, watching them both. You ready? Daniel asked softly. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on the frame that held their newest family photo, taken just last week on their front porch. In it, Daniel stood with his hand on Ethan's shoulder, both of them smiling, while Rex sat proudly between them, tongue lolling out in a happy dog grin. They walked together down the familiar path, fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet. Rex stayed close to Ethan's side, matching his pace step for step. When they reached Liam's headstone, the morning sun caught the polished granite, making the letters of his name shine bright. Ethan knelt down in the grass, carefully placing the framed photo against the stone. His small fingers traced his father's name before he spoke, his voice clear and steady. "We're okay, Dad," he said, a gentle smile on his face. "Uncle Danny takes care of us now." Daniel stood beside him, his chest tight with emotion. For years he'd carried the weight of guilt and failure, the burden of surviving when Liam hadn't. But watching Ethan now, seeing the peace in the boy's eyes, something shifted inside him. The crushing weight began to lift. He wasn't failing Liam anymore. He was keeping his promise, not just to protect Ethan, but to give him a real home, a real family. Rex nuzzled against Ethan's hand, and the boy scratched behind his ears. "Rex takes care of us, too," he added, making Daniel smile. When it was time to go, they walked back toward the truck together. Ethan's small hand found Daniel's, holding on tight. Rex trotted beside them, ears perked up, tail swaying gently. The morning breeze felt different now, lighter, cleaner somehow. Daniel looked down at Ethan's hand in his and felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. He didn't feel broken anymore. He wasn't just a soldier with too many scars and too many nightmares. He was something else now. Something better. He was a father. If you enjoyed this story, I handpicked the next one just for you. Don't miss it. Click here to watch.